coast prior to the sinking of the Titanic. There were 952 souls on board and 390 were saved. The SS Atlantic Heritage Park was developed by a group of volunteers whose mission it was first to restore the two burial sites and monuments and second to preserve the history of this disaster. The results of their efforts include an interpretation centre, which is home to the museum and craft shop, and a park with a beautiful boardwalk. Valda was instrumental in establishing this craft shop. One of the highlights of the craft shop is the Nova Scotia tartan products. Terrace Bay is the home of the Nova Scotia tartan. It was originally designed by local resident Bessie Murray in 1953 and produced by the star of the Sea Weaving Studio in Terrace Bay. I would like the members of this Nova Scotia House of Assembly to join me in thanking Valda for her community service and wish her and the SS Atlantic Society all the best in the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Time allotted for members' statements has expired. We'll now move on to orders of the day with oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Despite promising to honour the shipyard contract in full, it now appears that the new Liberal government in Ottawa is considering scaling it back. Mr. Speaker, federal briefing notes under consideration by the new Liberal government there spell out options as part of the national shipbuilding strategy, including cancellation of some of the projects. The largest project in that strategy is the $26 billion frigate program to be built here in Halifax. I know the Premier has raised this with the new Minister of Defence, but I would like to ask him if he's also raised this concern with the Prime Minister when he saw him earlier this week.
The Honourable Minister, the Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. As he knows, leading into the campaign, the Prime Minister was here, made an announcement that they're fully committed to the shipbuilding contract here in Halifax. I fully expect them to honour that commitment. When I had an opportunity to speak with the Defence Minister, who actually toured the shipyard, spoke very highly of the men and women who are working there and the work that's ongoing. We fully expect them to continue to honour that. I think it was obvious that the former Conservative government did not budget the appropriate amount of money associated to fulfil that contract, and the current Prime Minister has committed to honouring that commitment.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Irving Shipyard here in Halifax confirms that they are on time and on budget with the projects that they are responsible for. We have a new Prime Minister now. We have a Premier here in this House. And the fact of the matter is that Prime Minister Trudeau came to Halifax during the election campaign and promised every ship would be built, all 15 frigates and all of the Arctic Patrol vessels. So, yes, we all have the same concern now that this is under review. I'd like to ask the Premier, has he sought a guarantee from the Prime Minister or the Minister of Defence that they will honour the commitment that Ottawa made to Halifax and the shipyard in full?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member again for the question. The Prime Minister was here prior to the election campaign, made a commitment to the people of Canada that those ships would be built. I spoke with the Minister of Defence when he was here to the security forum. We again talked about the great work that was happening on the commitment to the shipyard. I read the article today in the news. I've reached out to the Department of National Defence today. I'm waiting to get a return call from the Minister of National Defence, but it's my expectation, I think the expectations of all Nova Scotians, that they will fulfill the contract at the shipyard, Mr. Speaker, and they'll fund it appropriately.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier is correct. The Prime Minister, when he was running, did come to Halifax, and he committed to all of the frigates and all of the patrol ships that are going to be built at the Halifax shipyard. But now the election is over. Their briefing notes from Ottawa say that some of these projects are under review, including the possibility of cancellation. So I'm going to ask the Premier, will he seek a guarantee from the federal government that they will honour that promise that they made to the people of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Again, as I said to the House, I reached out to the Minister of National Defence. I think what the briefing note that the Honourable Member is reflecting is the fact that they were referring to the incompetence of the former federal government when it came to budgeting, Mr. Speaker, and the fact there wasn't enough money to fulfill that contract. I fully expect, quite honestly, the Prime Minister to keep the commitment he made to the people of the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have been disappointed but what has happened at the highest levels in the Liberal government in recent weeks. They're upset that a Liberal cabinet minister invoked privilege to avoid testifying in court, and they're concerned that the Premier's Chief of Staff urged the member from Dartmouth East to have a criminal matter dropped, and also offered his wife a job to help bridge the gap following his removal from Cabinet. So my question for the Premier is, why did he continue to express confidence in Kirby McVicker and in his former Environment Minister after these unfortunate incidents became public?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and she's absolutely wrong when it comes to anything that is before the courts, Mr. Speaker. At no time, at any time did I ever suggest, reflect that anyone should be involved except allowing justice to be carried out in this province, Mr. Speaker. The member from Dartmouth East made a decision not to go to court for some obscure law, which I said to this House many times I did not even know existed. It was a decision that he made on his own, and that evening, Mr. Speaker, when I discovered that he misled me on what was told to him by the clerk of this House, I removed him from our caucus, Mr. Speaker, and from our Executive Council, exactly what Nova Scotians would expect me to do, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to my Chief of Staff, Mr. Speaker, he's an honourable, outstanding man, Mr. Speaker, who made a mistake and accepted the responsibility of that mistake.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've said in this House and in the media, I take the Premier at his word when he says he didn't know that the minister from Dartmouth East would refuse to appear in court, and that he didn't know what was said by his former Chief of Staff in that audio recording. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, in recent weeks, there's been a very public pattern of inappropriate conduct by top officials in the Liberal government, and this has called into question the tone, the bar that has been set by the Premier for his office and across government. So my question for the Premier is this: what steps has he taken to ensure that the inappropriate behaviour by his top officials comes to an end?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I disagree with the premise of our question, Mr. Speaker. I expect, Mr. Speaker, not only the members who work in my office, people who work across all government offices on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, to do with the highest level of integrity, Mr. Speaker, and do it in the best interest of all Nova Scotians. And it's been brought to my attention, Mr. Speaker, when that has not happened, I've acted.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party, and her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, I know the Premier wants to move on from the events of the past 3 weeks, and we'd all like to move on, but there are questions that still remain unanswered, and the Premier still has not taken responsibility for the actions of the people he picked to serve in his cabinet and to run his office. So my question for the Premier is this: why has he not tried to bring some closure to the entire affair and display some accountability by apologizing to Nova Scotians for what has transpired in recent weeks under his watch?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I believe I've acted on behalf of the people of this province in the way the people of this province would want me to act, Mr. Speaker, when information is brought to my attention that I believe is inappropriate. I acted quickly and swiftly, Mr. Speaker, to deal with it. Mr. Speaker, at any time when I have made a mistake, I have no problem apologizing to the people of this province. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, even with you putting a ruling in this House suggesting that the member misled this House about my language in this place, she's still unwilling to stand up and say I'm sorry. Why is it so hard for some members of this House to just apologize?
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, speaking of taking the actions that Nova Scotia expect, Many Nova Scotians are still wondering, why did the Premier put the member for Dartmouth East back in the Cabinet in the first place in July when there were so many questions still outstanding and so many issues unresolved, Mr. Speaker? So I'll just ask the Premier directly, why did he put the member for Dartmouth East back in his Cabinet in July when there were so many issues unresolved?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As I've said many times in this House, last December, the member from Dartmouth East was an alleged victim of an assault. In the case, Mr. Speaker, he had had a number of death threats that had been provided to him, that had been sent to him. Members of this House would have seen the security following him around. Mr. Speaker, he had raised health issues as well. So I went to the member at that time and said to him, he either takes a leave or I'm going to provide him a leave, Mr. Speaker. And I told him at the time, when he felt his health had returned, to let me know. I put him back in the queue. All members, when it came to coming back in the Executive Council, that's what took place, Mr. Speaker. He's no longer a member of this Executive Council or in our caucus, Mr. Speaker, because on the day that he evoked a privilege which is obscure to many Nova Scotians and used by members of this House, he gave me false information that was provided. He said that was provided to him from the clerk. When, Mr. Speaker, everyone who sits around my executive table, I have to be able to trust what they tell me. When I couldn't, I removed him not only from that table but from our caucus.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the return to Cabinet in July seemed strange enough at the time. But now, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians know that many issues were unresolved at that time, including what the member for Dartmouth East would do when he was faced with the trial which was supposed to occur earlier this fall, Mr. Speaker. That member spoke to the senior-most member of the Premier's office about how he expected that trial to go away, and in fact it did. So I asked the Premier, why didn't he wait until the legal issues were resolved for the member of Dartmouth East before returning him to Cabinet?
The Honourable Premier.
So let me get this straight, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Conservative Party should suggest that every alleged victim in this province should be forced to sit idly by while they wait for a court proceeding to go forward? Is that what he's suggesting? That an alleged victim of anything in this province should put their life on hold, Mr. Speaker? I did what I said I would do, Mr. Speaker. When the honourable member came back and suggested to me that health was returned, I would look at him like all other members to come back in this Executive Council. I had no idea what was happening with the court proceeding, Mr. Speaker. That is something the justice system will carry out, do its due diligence, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member in this House used a obscure law that every Nova Scotian believes was inappropriate, Mr. Speaker, and he misled me in this House, Mr. Speaker, and I acted quickly and swiftly, as Nova Scotians expect me to do.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when making decisions of public importance, government must ask themselves what's in the public interest. Do the benefits outweigh the risks? Through a Freedom of Information request, we've obtained a briefing note on P3s prepared for the Premier's office by the Deputy Minister of Health, which I will table, Mr. Speaker. In it, there are 4 redacted lines about the benefits of public-private partnerships and 45 redacted lines about the risks associated with P3 models. So my question for the Premier is this. Could he please inform members of the House of the risks that are associated with the 3P model for public infrastructure?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. A P3 model is a potential opportunity to build infrastructure in this province. It's a relationship between government and private sector, Mr. Speaker. We've seen it where it's worked in this province and other parts of Canada, Mr. Speaker. Are there challenges associated with it? Obviously, the contracts have to be built properly to make sure that it's in the best interest of taxpayers. We review them to see if it's whether or not we go the P3 model or whether we build it ourselves, Mr. Speaker. But the fact of the matter is, when we build buildings ourselves, we haven't done a great job at it. All I have to think is the Truro Hospital, Mr. Speaker, when it was budgeted for, and then I looked up where we ended up. All of these things have challenges. The appropriate thing is that the due diligence is done at the beginning, at the front end, and everyone knows what the parameters are when you go through it.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, there are substantial warning signs about the worth of a P3 model for public infrastructure. Auditor Generals right across the country have questioned the fiscal reasons for taking the P3 route. The new federal government of Canada has removed the Harper government's P3 screening requirement for public infrastructure projects. Now we have learned that a deputy minister in the Premier's government has raised concerns in a briefing note to the Premier about a P3 model. So my question for the Premier is this: given the volume of evidence against P3s, why is his government considering this route for public infrastructure in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's important for the honourable member to recognize that Nova Scotians gave us the privilege to govern this province, Mr. Speaker, and by doing so, they've asked us to look at all options when it comes to building infrastructure, when it comes to providing services to people of this province, and that's exactly what we intend to do, to go out to find the pros, the cons associated with any venture we go into, Mr. Speaker. It was their government that approved the Convention Centre, which is a P3 project. Why are they so opposed to P3 projects when they go ahead and do it, Mr. Speaker? What happened when they crossed the floor?
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians were shocked this summer to learn that the Premier had hired a corporation as his senior deputy minister, B.F. Miller Services Incorporated. Everyone knows that the reason for that company was to save money, to give a tax break to that one person, a tax break that is not available to the rest of us who are asked to pay our fair share, Mr. Speaker. Why did the Premier give such a special tax break to his senior deputy minister?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I want to also thank Mr. Miller for committing to public service on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia. He's doing an outstanding job on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and to suggest that he's not paying taxes in the province is completely inaccurate. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, we were the ones that lowered the dividend credit that government complained about the fact we were doing, Mr. Speaker. They were the very party that complained in the House, Mr. Speaker, that we actually closed the gap, Mr. Speaker. That's what you get from that side of the House, Mr. Speaker. Complaint after complaint without a single reason to move this province forward. And let me be clear, Mr. Miller is paying taxes in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, everything the Premier said would be accurate if he'd actually hired Mr. Miller as a person, like all the rest of us are hired, Mr. Speaker, in this province, but he didn't. He hired B.F. Miller Incorporated, a small business specifically designed to pay less tax than every other Nova Scotian. Those are the facts, Mr. Speaker. That's what happened. Instead of just hiring the person, Mr. Speaker, he created a special tax structure to pay less than the rest of us. It may be in Nova Scotia, but it's not the same amount that every other Nova Scotian is asked to pay. The Premier once said, Mr. Speaker, outside this chamber, he does not want to have two classes of workers in this province. So why did he go ahead and create two? One for Bernie Miller Incorporated and another for all the rest of us.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member knows what he's saying is completely inaccurate. We did not create any possibility, Mr. Speaker. Every small business owner in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, can do that. Is that member saying in this province we should be putting more pressure and closing small businesses in Nova Scotia? That no small business owner in Nova Scotia should ever be involved with government? No small business owner has the talent to be able to come into the public service to help us deliver services in Nova Scotia? Is that what you're saying? Are you against small business owners in this province? Are you against small business people?
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also for the Premier. The government has been telling Nova Scotians everyone must tighten their belts. Everyone must feel the pain. And yet, hot on the heels of a $42,000 office renovation for his own office, we learned that the Premier has spent $75,000 to renovate a new cabinet room. This at a time when the government is cutting funding to many community organizations. So my question for the Premier today is, why are snazzy offices more important than community organizations?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As I said to him, and actually he would know, he visited my office, Mr. Speaker, with his daughter. when he brought his daughter to work and I invited him over, he should come. The only change in my office, Mr. Speaker, is a door. It's not $42,000 change to my door. There was renovations done, Mr. Speaker, in one government place. The only thing in my office was a doorway, Mr. Speaker. It wasn't $42,000. Furthermore, to the changes in the cabinet room, Mr. Speaker, as you would know, the Speaker's office required a committee room, Mr. Speaker. We now have a committee room in one government place where all members of this House get a privilege to come in and sit at committees and talk to Nova Scotians. Those renovations were made, Mr. Speaker. Cabinet has to have a place to meet, Mr. Speaker. He will never have to worry about that situation, Mr. Speaker. But in future days, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, there are people who will be given the privilege to be in the Executive Council, Mr. Speaker, and they need a meeting room.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate the Premier's concern over what I'm concerned about. I think the Premier has plenty to be concerned about himself, sir. Thank you very much. When Nova Scotians fix up a room in their home, they try to get the best bang for their buck. And that means looking for the best price for things. And looking at the budget for the cabinet renovation, it's hard to believe the government looks for a bargain. The bill for painting alone in this room, $20,000. Does the Premier believe that a $20,000 paint job for a boardroom is a respectful use of taxpayer dollars, or is it a snow job?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The reality of it, Mr. Speaker, this is space that the people of the province of Nova Scotia own, Mr. Speaker. The renovations that were done by hard-working public servants, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia. The honourable member would know that. Is he suggesting, Mr. Speaker, that the people that work for the people of Nova Scotia are incapable of renovating an office space? Or would he prefer, Mr. Speaker, that we went out and rented a piece of space and left that one vacant?
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. The Old Capital District Health Authority had a plan to replace the Centennial Building, which with construction to begin in 2016, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. We hear from the Minister of Health last week about a new plan with the new hospital, a plan that may be a public-private partnership or a P3 model. So I'd like to ask the Minister, is the P3 model the Minister considering for the construction of the new hospital, the delivery of health services, or both?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the Premier has referenced already today, in our tight fiscal times, we will look at all options to provide the QE2 facilities for the future. We know in this province that we have some very strong examples where P3 works very well. Scotia Surgery. We also know that TriStar, the emergency medical vehicles, is again a P3 arrangement, and I believe the former government put Strongest Families in place with a private delivery of that service.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, in a government briefing note titled Public-Private Partnership in Healthcare, which I'll table, Mr. Speaker, there are 4 completed redacted lines about the benefits, 4, and 45 redacted lines about the risks, 45, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Health has already spoken about what he sees as some of the benefits of the public-private partnership in healthcare, but, Mr. Speaker, what are the risks?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. From my time, I guess, in public office, but also as a citizen of Nova Scotia, we have examples in both ways of constructing buildings where, in fact, the construction has been of a poor quality. The best price has not been garnered. We have examples in both areas. So I think to say one can't work, if a private-public partnership can't work, is something I certainly don't believe in.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you today is to the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, as is well known by the Minister, we have been having I don't want to call it a dispute, but an ongoing issue In Windsor, West Hants, around amalgamation, we've had the Citizens Coalition, the ARC group, come together and put a petition together asking residents to sign in an effort to be amalgamated in our area. And I'll read just a part of that, Mr. Speaker. We, the undersigned election municipality West Hants, believe our municipal governance structure cannot achieve the best results for our region due to the lack of cooperation between the municipality of West Hants and the town of Windsor. It lists a number of examples, Mr. Speaker. I wonder at what point, once this bit of a unique piece is filed, where does the government get involved? And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. I think it's very exciting that we have seen local community groups being leaders when it comes to pushing for structural change in our province, Mr. Speaker. There is no better scenario than in West Hants and Windsor why amalgamations need to happen in some areas. And to see a grassroots movement moving in that direction at the community level, I think, shows a great spirit in that community to look towards the future and identify what they need to do to change. And, Mr. Speaker, we will be a partner with that group and all levels of government that want to be a part of that change as well.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister's answer. The document I just tabled has 2,500 plus signatures on it, and I'm sure there'll be more to come of those who are interested in that amalgamation to take place. Being that a third party, if you will, is part of tabling this application, is there a legislative change? I know the MGA is specific to how municipal partnerships work. Where this is a third party, is there a piece of legislation where within the MGA section of that could be amended or changed, etc., to allow the province to become a funding partner and support, as we've seen in other amalgamations or dissolutions, etc.?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Any municipal governments that are interested in structural change, whether it's amalgamation, dissolution, what have you, they can find a partner in our government, a funding partner on occasion as well. I know that the member opposite has been a champion for change in his community, Mr. Speaker. He's been a champion for reason, and I want to thank him for pushing this issue locally. And also, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank that member for at a time when we have both leaders of the opposition standing up and dragging this House through a soap opera, the likes of which this House has not seen in a long time, that member stands up and speaks on behalf of his community, and all in this House could learn from his example.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the opposite side of the House for that nice, warm welcome. Mr. Speaker, my question through you will be to the Minister of TIR. Nova Scotia's fire services are instrumental to the safety of our homes and our communities. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, I have 16 fire departments that serve my constituency. We understand that the Fire Service Association of Nova Scotia is concerned about a number of issues which they recently brought forward to the attention of this government. A number of rural Nova Scotia volunteer fire departments are prevented from performing important training because of highway weight restrictions. My question to the Minister is, does the Minister intend to make any changes this spring that will allow fire departments to do their training?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to thank the member for the question. We all would certainly agree, all of us in the House and all Nova Scotians, the importance of the fire services of Nova Scotia and the protection they give to our people. And Mr. Speaker, to be clear, those services are exempt from any restrictions when there is a fire, so it is only with respect to training and preparation for the fire services. Shortly after they met with our caucus in mid-October, about 2 weeks later, the fire services representatives met with my senior officials, Dan Leopold, to discuss some of these things. We are committed to working together. We are going to look at the changes. Mr. Speaker, there's nothing that takes precedence over fire services and what they do in the community, so we are going to take those, have those conversations, take their suggestions, and we're going to do everything we possibly can to make sure that we reflect in our policies and in our laws the exact things that the association is looking for. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for that answer because fire services are important, especially in rural Nova Scotia, so that's a positive answer and I appreciate it. Another issue that concerns firefighters is the poor communication between TIR and Nova Scotia emergency providers. Knowing that a road is closed or a bridge is out or ferry service isn't operating saves precious minutes when emergency providers are headed to an incident. My question to the Minister would be, will the Minister commit to looking at ways of improving communications between TIR and emergency providers to save time and confusion and hopefully lives?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that is the second issue that the Fire Services Association brought to our department. A lot of what focused around for the conversation, at least, was that informing fire services that are outside maybe the jurisdiction or the area of the particular fire, so bringing in and collaborating with other fire services, volunteer firefighters, so that they're available and get a heads up with respect to the fire. And again, for the road closures, there is a process and procedure in place that allows EMO, fire services, police services to get heads up on roads, restricted roads that are closed. But certainly, again, one of the requests specifically was that we look at that and create a mechanism whereby they have a lot of the control over letting that service, letting the people know when there is restricted areas that they can go in and possibly opening them up. So that is on the agenda, and we'll do everything we can with communications as well. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, I want to acknowledge and thank the Minister for visiting Trenton and meeting with the Hillside Trenton Environmental Group on September the 28th. 1 week after this meeting, I received a request to visit the Hillside area to once again personally witness a heavy covering of fly ash that has plagued the area of Hillside, Trenton, Pictou Landing and surrounding area. My question to the Minister, will the Minister give an update of any progress that has occurred since the September meeting?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yes, as the member opposite has pointed out, I did meet with the concerned citizens from Trenton Hillside in particular that live close to the Trenton plant, and I certainly got a great insight into a wide variety of concerns that they presented on that occasion. And on November 3rd, I met with the CEO, Bob Hanf, of Nova Scotia Power to present those concerns to him.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, following the election, this particular group met with the former Environment and Energy Ministers, and they told the Hillside Trenton Group this issue was a top priority. They have been seeking help and solutions that have affected their properties, vehicles, gardens and orchards receiving coatings of fly ash. Their main concern is the possibility of health side effects from these emissions. The question to the Minister, will the Minister initiate an independent study to determine what impact, if any, the fly ash emissions could have on the health of the residents living in this area?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for that question. But I also, at this point, will get a follow-up from the CEO of Nova Scotia Power, Bob Hanf, in terms of what I presented. I'm sure it's information that, for the most part, he's very familiar with. But I certainly want to see his reaction to my meeting. I also know that the date for the industrial permit is also coming very, very close in the next month or so. Again, we'll be in touch with the residents once we see where those two reports bring us.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal, and I will table a briefing note prepared by the Premier's Office on public-private partnerships. It states, and I quote, an estimated more than $300 million in tolls were produced on the Cobequid Pass for a deal in which private financiers put up $66 million. The government is paying an effective interest rate of 10% over 30 years, twice its rate of borrowing. End of quote. Given this information, Mr. Speaker, in the government's own briefing note, why is the minister contemplating building more P3 toll highways?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. Certainly with respect to the Cobequid Pass, from a funding perspective and from a policy perspective, Mr. Speaker, the amounts collected through the tolls, through the user fees, they pay the bills, they pay the operational costs, and they go into the corporation, which covers the finances of a tolling area and a corridor that's extremely expensive and extremely valuable for our safety, Mr. Speaker, for our mobility of the province, and certainly for the economy. There's no cookie cutter for P3s, Mr. Speaker. There's a number of different aspects that go into policies. With respect to the Cobequid Pass, that decision was made a long time ago, Mr. Speaker. I know that the people who travel through that corridor, who use it, from businesses to residents to everyday users, Mr. Speaker, think that's a success in terms of its ability to pay, in terms of the safety for that roadway, the maintenance that's done there, Mr. Speaker. So that's a particular policy that I think is a pretty strong one, but again, it's case-by-case basis when it comes to P3 models. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Queen Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, in the Freedom of Information response obtained by the NDP caucus, the Department of Transportation provided 17 pages of blacked-out information related to P3 partnerships. That 17 pages, blacked-out pages, were a presentation on tolling 9 P3 highways. Mr. Speaker, will the minister make this full presentation available so that the independent body can evaluate and assess the long-term impact to Nova Scotians on going down the P3 highways once again?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the messages that we get repeatedly from Nova Scotians with respect to our 100 Series highway is the idea of safety, Mr. Speaker. What can we do to improve safety, to enhance safety for all of us, Mr. Speaker? Those of us in the House, many Nova Scotians, our family and friends who use the highways. We embarked on a cutting-edge, first-of-its-kind feasibility study, Mr. Speaker. Not only will give us the information required, but it will also give public consultation, so the people of Nova Scotia will have their say, Mr. Speaker. We're not imposing that on anyone, Mr. Speaker. We're going to get the information, we're going to give it to the people who put us here, and we'll let them decide and provide the feedback, Mr. Speaker. There's nothing wrong with that approach.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is also to the Minister of TIR. As we know, the St. Peter's Junction to Sydney section of the railway has been shut down. The Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal has been doing all he can to help save the rail line. In a September 22, 2014 article in the Cape Breton Post, the Liberal MP for Sydney Victoria said, and I quote, "We see the government helping other short lines remain open in other parts of Canada, and we should be seeing the same here." And I'll table that article, Mr. Speaker. My question is, what conversations have been taking place with the federal government and the member for Sydney Victoria now that the government has changed?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member across the hall for that question. Look, the consistent message we have had, I certainly have had with respect to Cape Breton Rail, is that the ideal situation, Mr. Speaker, is that we have a private sector entity operate this line, and it supports a business model at the Port of Sydney and elsewhere in the Cape Breton region to provide real traffic, Mr. Speaker. We're still there, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the legislation that was supported with, on the rail line by all parties. With all the activities we've done around the rail, we need to find that private sector player to run this line. Having said that, when there's discussions with the federal government, with our municipal partners, and of course for the province, we'll do everything we can to support that. But where we're at now is where we were with day one. We want the private sector to run this rail line. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, we know that the rail line operated with a subsidy from the provincial government and was breaking even with that subsidy. The MP then asked the Transportation Minister what she would do to save the line, and she said the federal government is not going to be involved in keeping this line open. The response from the MP at the time, Mr. Speaker, that the minister's answer was unacceptable. Has the minister been given reassurances that the MP will get an acceptable answer now that the federal Liberals are in power?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, there's literally zero traffic on the line. There was a few hundred, 500 per year, prior to the decision for Genesee, Wyoming to discontinue and ultimately file for abandonment, Mr. Speaker. We're a long way from talking about infrastructure investments if we don't have traffic. If we don't have a business model, these are moot points now. So what we're looking for, we're working with the Port Authority, the Port Development officials, the Mayor, the CBRM, of course our federal partners who are there at the table with us. But, Mr. Speaker, we've got to create the case and look at what business options are out there. Then we can talk about infrastructure, we can talk about investment. But until we get to that point, Mr. Speaker, there's no one responsible for doing the infrastructure improvements and upgrades that are required on the Sydney subdivision until we have traffic on the line. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. The short-stay mental health unit at the Aberdeen Hospital was supposed to reopen on November 3rd. Today is the 27th, and it hasn't reopened, and there's no sign that it's going to happen anytime soon. Today is the 26th. Sorry, a little difference in what's happening here. Yesterday, during adjournment debate, in speaking about this unit, the member for Halifax-Shabukto said the NSHA told us it was a temporary closure, and we expect NSHA to recruit professionals they need to reopen the facility. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, members in the community are telling me that the job postings for the positions in this unit have been removed. So it's a little hard to recruit if you're not actually posting for jobs. So my question for the Minister today is this government recruiting for those positions or not?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can convey to the member opposite is that the Nova Scotia Health Authority is responsible for the recruitment of clinicians, and as of last week, when I had my briefing, I was basically informed about the work that is going on in Pictou as a result of the closure. I hadn't asked about, nor was I presented with where the status is on recruitment.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that response. I'm concerned to hear that the minister is not checking on the status of recruitment, because we've been led to believe this is completely a staffing issue. So you only solve staffing issues with recruitment, Mr. Speaker. So last night in late debate, we also heard that additional temporary hires are being made in the hospital to support the emergency department with mental health professionals. So we're hearing about temporary positions being filled, while the temporary closure shows no signs of stopping. So every indication really points to the fact that this government is leaving the short-stay unit closed. That's the concern, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the minister today is, now knowing what he now knows, will he direct the NSHA to make the appropriate arrangements and hire the appropriate staff so that the short-stay unit can be reopened, just as he has promised it will be?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And in terms of the overall plan of mental health delivery for the province, that is in the hands of the Nova Scotia Health Authority. I have every confidence in Dr. Corey and the work that she is doing to know what the citizens of our province need. And I know that in terms of the work of Dr. Vino in Pictou, the right solutions for mental health now and for the future. And when I look at the delivery of mental health in the home, yes, a leading practice that is now taking place in Pictou. And I know also with the development of the emergency room, there will be separate triaging for those in trauma and mental health crisis, which again will be state-of-the-art for Pictou County. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. When questioned about various Provincial Auditor General's concerns about the public-private partnership, the Health Minister said that he supports them, stating, and I quote, "P3 models have served this province very well," and cited the Scotia surgery as an example, Mr. Speaker, and I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Health tell us why he believes that P3 models have served Nova Scotia well?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We know that in terms of providing health services in the province, there are only 4 examples that I'm familiar with. These are 4 that have actually served our province very, very well, some for a number of years, some more recent, such as the Strongest Families program, which has a private deliverer of mental health service, Medtronic, again, which procurement of defibrillators. Those partnerships have worked extremely well in our province, and I think it's important to be open to that possibility. We know that, I think the member opposite knows that as a government, we have made no such commitment, but it's part of the investigative process.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to table a briefing note prepared by the Deputy Minister of Health, and he writes, I quote, "Another criticism of the P3s where a private clinic is contracted to provide publicly insured services is that the private clinic does simple surgeries, leaving the more complex cases for the public health system. The public system is burdened with more complex care. This means that any cost savings that come from the reduced overall number of surgeries are clawed back by the increased cost of those complex surgeries." End quote, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, given that his own deputy minister has raised concerns about the P3 projects, why is the minister potentially considering a public-private partnership for the new hospital or even healthcare delivery in the province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I know at this stage is that we've made a considerable change in the way that all capital construction projects will go on from this day forward. We know that we've had some situations where both the cost, the quality of the build did not have the kind of oversight, whether it was private or public building. We've now put in place a process where stage gating will require a company, both in terms of meeting the financials as well as the quality, will be required throughout every build from this time forward.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Immigration. The federal government has promised 25,000 Syrian refugees by Christmas. They've since realized that is not practical. But when these refugees do come, they will need our help with health services, with career planning services. What specific funding will the province offer to help?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. Nova Scotia is ready to do its part and to share responsibility and work with the federal government as well as all provinces in this country. We've had extensive discussions and extensive cooperations from all across government here in the province, as well as our settlement organizations, local groups, all our partners, and we have discussions with the federal government, and at this point in time it is our expectation that the federal government will be paying for the settlement resources for the refugees that are coming. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, it is good to hear that there are funds being made available. Those who come to Nova Scotia will need to feel valued, and their first experience when they do come here has to be a good one. Within 2 weeks, will the Minister table a plan of action that shows the federal funding that will be coming forward and how it will, the province, how it will use that funding to retain these people as contributing citizens of our province? Because, Mr. Speaker, I believe they deserve that opportunity.
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The situation is one that is unfolding. Every single day there's more and more information that we are learning, and I'm very happy to say that I've had 3 conversations already with my federal counterpart. We also had a telephone conference call yesterday with all our federal, provincial, territorial ministers. I have officials going to Toronto this weekend to obtain more information, so I've already told the media and told the public that we will be providing information as we have it. So definitely we will be doing that once the information becomes available. We've been working across government departments with the Canadian Red Cross, with our reach partners across the province, with ISANS, with all of the SAPs, the service providers, and so there's extensive work that's going on. Thanks very much.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Nova Scotia students lag behind other provinces in math and reading scores. Mr. Speaker, the Freeman report in November, followed by an action plan released in January, offered the public a glimpse of possible improvements. In a CBC article dated October 30th, 2014, it states, yesterday the minister said she wasn't interested in simply tinkering with a system that has been through too many small changes in recent years. My question to the minister, wouldn't a collective agreement without key education reform be considered tinkering?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
You can tell. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member for the question. I'm very proud to stand here as the Minister of Education to acknowledge that education has become a priority for our government. We recognize that 19,000 Nova Scotians told us that we needed to look at change. We embraced that. We brought teachers in who are those who deliver the change in the classroom, and the change was designed by teachers to respond to the very concerns that have been raised about math and literacy in this province. And, Mr. Speaker, we are moving forward with the action plan.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And education is a priority, I think, of all parties in the House, and I'm very happy to hear that it's the priority of the present government. The government traded everything that would positively impact students in exchange for teacher salary increases. In the minister's own press release, she is quoted as saying, I look forward to reviewing the report and creating an action plan for change. And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Seeing as there has been nearly a year for review, my question for the minister, if this deal is voted down, will the minister recommit to the educational reform that actually impacts students as presented in the Freeman report?
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers have expired. Just before we'll move on to government business, the Honourable Minister of Labour on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to draw the members' attention to the East Gallery, where I have a couple of constituents joining us today, Peter and Hope McIntosh. Hope is here to learn more about how government works, and I would like the honourable members to give them a warm welcome here in the House. And Mr. Speaker, I just want to let them know that I'll join them as soon as the whip lets me out of here, because he's really tough. Thank you.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To please call government business bills, public bills for second reading.
Just before we do that, the Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in my place on a point of order. Mr. Speaker, during question period, the